Hello and welcome to Second Rate Film School. I'm Andrew Wass, and today we're going to be interviewing one of the head writers for Courage the Cowardly Dog, David Steven Cohen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, the head writer. I don't mind saying it was. It's actually, and I don't. It's a kind of a badge of honor to spend 4 seasons on one project, basically from beginning to end. It's the longest I ever spent working on a single project in my career. It was like 4 seasons, and you really get to know the characters, and they begin to haunt you. It was very intense. It was a lot of stuff in a relatively short period of production time. Yeah. Anyway, it's my little summary of life as the head writer of the show, working with John, and basically the way I view my role on the show. I'll just leave it at this: is John had a wonderful child, and then I helped raise the child, and I hold Courage dear to my heart, and I think I took a lot with me from working on that show.
Apologies on the head writer's gaffe. There was a discrepancy on the Courage Wikia, which also listed Irv Bauer and William Hohauser as head writers, versus IMDb, which does just list you. So I guess I just gotta go edit that Wikia page now.
Oh, no problem.
So to begin, I guess we'll start from there. Who else was typically in the writer's room?
We had 3 people besides myself and John at the writers' table. Irv Bauer, William Hohauser, and Michelle Dilworth, John's sister, were at the table as as writers, or like William is really great with gags, so they had different things to offer, and then we would bring in the freelancer of the week and hammer out a story. And because of production exigencies and all of that, I really didn't. I wanted to have a solid sense of the story before the writer left the room to go and write, an outline. So you don't want surprises down the line from that. But Irv wrote many episodes, and or several. I haven't counted. And William, I'm not sure if he was credited as a writer on any episodes, but he's, contributed to the writing and is probably listed as such on the show. And it was wonderful watching Michelle, John's sister, really kind of develop. And I remember when she wrote her first script, and she only wrote a couple, but it was really good. And it just made me feel so good, because I don't think she'd had that experience before of writing a full script on her own. So I was kind of given these people as sort of consultants, and they were John's hires. And then I, as has been the case often in my career, I'm brought into a room of people and say, okay, you're in charge of this part of the show, win everyone's trust and make it work. It's like, okay, and I'm not here to change things. I'm here to help a vision be realized. And as soon as the sooner I can tune into that particular vision and help communicate it to freelancers and all of that, the better. So with Courage, it was easy because it was such a solid concept from the beginning, such a brilliant idea, and John's conception of these 3 characters in the middle of literally nowhere, visited by and one of them is a lightning rod for evil, and she can't even perceive evil, And Courage, it was a gem. And sweet little Courage has to protect her and live up to his name, and the farmer. I mean, we all know Eustace. It was a gold mine of character-generated stories. It wasn't just about the guest monster of the week. It was what will challenge our characters, what will challenge Courage the most, and what are his fears. It was interesting because we had several freelancers who wrote several episodes, and the show sort of takes on its voice as episodes get written, and I'm hearing things and John's hearing things, and I could sort of hear within the first few episodes as I found certain rhythms for the characters, both in terms of their actions and their desires and their voices. So it was, yeah, it was a crazy amount of work and kind of psychedelic.
Now, originally I was going to jokingly say you only wrote a couple episodes here and there because, haha, head writer of the show, of course they wrote a lot. But holy cow, you did write a lot. Nearly half of the segments, in fact. So you weren't just the head writer, you were often the writer. So please explain the difference between the two positions on the show and the process of writing an episode of Courage.
As head writer, I directed the writing, and I did some. I like to do as little rewriting as possible. I want the writers to, really get to know the show, which is hard to do when they're not like a staff; they're a revolving door of freelancers. But in order to meet our production schedule in our accelerated second season, we doubled episodes, and if I wrote an episode myself, it took less time to get it through the pipeline than if someone else was writing it. It took up less of my time, So I had to write a lot of episodes myself for a while. But yeah, I wrote about half of them.
44 out of the 102 segments by my count.
Yeah, it was something like that. And I certainly had my hand in most of the others. I mean, certainly. And there were very few. It was one or two at the beginning that I wasn't there for or that involved in. And then a couple that John kind of owned entirely, and it's like, certainly have your vision, and if I had any thoughts, I would offer them. But other than that, yeah, I was, my fingerprints are all over all over the show, and its fingerprints, its paw prints are all over me.
Briefly going back in time, the series obviously was predated by John's 1996 short, The Chicken from Outer Space, which you were not part of. So when and how were you brought on for the series proper?
I was aware of the short, and the show had been picked up already by Cartoon Network. That the Oscar-nominated short acted as a pilot for the series, and there were a couple of episodes in, still looking for the head writer. And one of the people working on the show, sort of at John's right hand, her brother had worked with me on a Dr. Seuss series and recommended me for the gig. So it was the best way to, it was another situation where an agent or a manager had nothing to do with it, but, took the 10%. And the best possible way, I worked with someone who liked me and thought I did a good job running this Dr. Seuss series. And when somebody recommends you, it's very meaningful because they're putting their reputation on the line. And I have a lot of respect. Alan Newworth is the name of the fellow who recommended me, Risa Newworth, his sister who worked with John. And it was it didn't have a lot of executive moving parts. It wasn't like, agents setting up meetings and, network executives. Linda Semensky, as head of Cartoon Network, did not interfere. She was the least interfering executive. She gave us all the room we wanted to work. So that's, that was my involvement. I had a sort of, initially I walk into a room and I don't know, and John's an interesting fellow. And, it just all happened. And suddenly we're making the show, and you don't get to stop to think about, so I just want to do the best version of the show that John has created and serve that vision. So, when I started, this was from 0 to 60 in a second. There was a lot of work to be done already.
Well, we've now hit the ground running and we're in the writer's room. Before we get into any specific episodes, one aspect of Courage I've always really liked is, despite him obviously having a ton of human attributes, he, unlike most other cartoon dogs, be it Scooby-Doo, Dynomutt, Goofy, Astro, and so on, behaved much more close to a dog than any of them. What was that like writing him, and what was the process?
I was just watching a show, in fact, just before we began the conversation, I was watching a Netflix show called The Secret Life of Animals, and it's not animated, it's about animals, and their relationship with humans and how smart they are and how intuitive they are, how they think. And it was really, it felt perfect, sort of like as an introduction for, having this discussion, because I realized I've spent a good deal of my career getting inside the heads of animals and actually looking at my cats, like my two cats. And I was thinking like, well, what would you do in a situation like this? Because it's a legitimate question. With Courage, we wanted him to act like a dog, not just a anthropomorphic Bugs Bunny, which is great. I love Bugs Bunny. Nothing wrong with Bugs Bunny. But it's just what would a dog do? Not just what would a human do, but that's the extra layer. Is like, there's certain things a dog can't resist, and that would often get Courage, in trouble.
Well, diving into the series proper and specific episodes, basically from day one, you were hitting home runs, even with your first episode, the second segment of episode 3, Hothead, which is one of my favorite episodes.
Okay.
What's noteworthy about this episode is it's the first one where Eustace is the Eustace we actually see for the rest of the series. Yes, he was a jerk who got injured in the previous episodes, but this was the first of many where he's the primary antagonist, and his comeuppance at the end is directly linked to his actions, not just a cosmic punishment for being mean earlier in the episode to Courage. Even in the short film, he turns into a giant chicken and is killed, but he didn't really actually do anything that warranted it.
Yeah, well, thank you for noticing that, and it's a very important point, and I kind of referenced it a few moments ago, but story comes from character, and often I find that what I bring to the party when I'm brought in to sort of help the writing move forward in whatever capacity that is, the more the character's actions are responsible for the trouble the character's in, the better the story becomes immediately. And there are just a lot of people who it's easy. It's not. It is common to sort of approach a story from the outside in, and sort of say, well, what kind of monster could come and terror? But I'd rather ask myself, well, what is Courage's worst fear? Well, it'll be losing Muriel. Okay, well, that's at the center of the show, but Eustace is such a bastard. He's constantly doing things that deserve punishment. So let's make that central to, his greed. Return the Slab, written by Bill Marsili, a friend of mine. His greed is what causes that to happen. And Muriel is just an innocent in the middle of it, but that doesn't mean her actions can't cause the problem. And that's even funnier to me, because she isn't aware that the dog food she made is what got them all into trouble, But when you're trying to undo your deeds or those of someone you're helping, it's much better than just trying to solve the problem. Like, how do I get this spider off my head? Arbitrarily picking that. It's not a particular reference to an episode. But I think that's a very apt observation on your part.
The next episode I'd like to discuss is probably your most famous, Freaky Fred. Outside of The Curse of King Ramses, this is probably the most well-known and often considered the creepiest episodes of the entire series. So where did the idea to do it all in rhyme come from, and why a freaky barber who's obsessed with shaving to the point that many fans call it out as being a thinly veiled fetish for Fred?
Well, the second thing, the character and his freaky fetish, which is a word I would stay away from, I guess, because there are people who have viewed this episode, as being something more than it was intended to be. Something darker, but it was all. I was walking in the village in Manhattan, in the West Village, with John, and I remember exactly where we were. And I remember we were crossing a street, and he said, "I want to do an episode." He knew that I love to write verse, and I had just come off doing 20 Seuss musicals for Nickelodeon, so half hours of solid rhyme. And I'm a lyricist. I just love wordplay. So he said, John knew that. He said, let's do this one in rhyme. And I want it to be about a freaky barber who just can't stop shaving. He's driven to shave. And, the Sweeney Todd allusion certainly was obvious. But Fred was his own kind of character. And, then it was a matter of finding a rhyming pattern and cadence that spoke to the character John had described to me, and that further brought him forward. This Freaky Fred gave him as much character as we could, so that he wasn't just a monster of the week. And I remember when I found it, and that's what made me naughty, as the last line for pretty much every verse. I said, I found it. Naughty is the word. And Bill Marsili, who wrote the episode with me, and also wrote King Ramsay's Curse, is also a very good versifier. He had worked for me on Seuss. It's a very funny story about how I met him, but for another time. And one of the few people I would say, I'm doing something in verse, you want to do it with me, because it'll be fun. And I kind of came up with the template for it, and then we just kind of like riffed on each other's ideas. I think I was like in the first half, he was in the second half, then we swapped, and it was fun because I did start out my career with a partner, working with somebody across the table from me at all times, and I kind of missed that interaction. But it's a rare thing to find somebody who you can really mesh with, whether it's in every possible way, or hey, this guy knows how to write verse, and has a dark sensibility like I do, and let's have some fun, let's jam. But that was the beginning of Fred. Was in John's head, and bringing him to life, giving him that voice, and I forget at what point. I mean, I don't know if it was after the fact that Paul Scheffler, who did the voice, who I'd seen on Broadway as Captain Hook. I mean, he's a tremendous actor, great voice actor, but a great stage actor as well. I forget when I first heard the voice, because it's hard for me to think of even writing the script without hearing that voice in my head, So, but that voice brought as much to the character as, what I wrote for the character. And it really points at something very interesting, which is how a character develops in each of the, the conception of the character, and then the artists, this is what the character looks like. This is the graphic presentation of the character. There's what the character thinks and says, how it acts, and how that affects the story. So there's the writing, and there's the music. Jody Gray and Andy Ezrin, who's scored the show, brilliant, and that helped Fred with their little the really haunting theme that plays underneath it, which is a sort of a twist and turn version of several different pieces of music, that come to mind, but all very twisted. And it really is. And then Paul Scheffler delivers this character, this performance, all with under the direction of the director and storyboard artists. It's I look at that episode and I feel everyone's contribution to that character. I mean, I feel a sense of authorship, but I remember, I wasn't there when John first thought of it, or maybe he had just thought of it. I don't know, but it was wonderful to be there for sort of the conception for me of the character, and then sort of seeing how dimensional he became as he progressed down the conveyor belt of production, and all the people involved really tuned in to what was there, in terms of what John had created in this character, what we had written. Um, and it really is. I mean, today there's on YouTube, there's a project called Reanimated. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, it's very trippy.
Oh yeah. So there's the Freaky Fred Reanimated, where each shot is redone by a different animator with the original intention in terms of story, but a different style. And it's really psychedelic. You've seen it. And it went up, and it like very quickly got a couple million hits, and now it's up to like 7 million or something like that. And it filled me with joy to see like that work then interpreted by all of these young artists who grew up or came up watching the show and learning from not just this show, but different, there's a lot of Easter eggs that they plant in those scenes. But it really, we had no idea how much power this would have, when you're doing the show, you're just trying to get it done. And I'm trying to keep it good. And 20 some odd years later, it's got this cult status, which I wish we had then. It's funny, when things like you work on things and they're hits and they stay alive a certain amount of time, and then like they go away. But 20 years later, you're saying, oh, it's a resurgence of, it's when the kids who watch the show as kids become adults and they start getting tattoos of your characters. You did something indelible and turned it into literal ink on flesh.
Yeah, I have to say, I think myself as having a really great memory, but in the lead up to this, I've been watching Courage more in the past few weeks than the last 15 years. And while doing this, I'm rediscovering episodes I barely remember, as well as being reminded of how fantastic the series was. There are a handful of episodes, though, that I've always had a deep memory of. Two in particular are The Short, The Chicken from Outer Space, and The Curse of King Ramses, as they were included in the VHS tapes of Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost and Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders.
Right. Yeah, I remember that when, to get the episodes, like they would show up on a Scooby-Doo tape or DVD, and it's like, oh wow, an episode came out. Then they released them finally. Not that I get any residuals from that, but it's great. I know. Is it still streaming on HBO?
It is. I'm just a weirdo who loves buying physical media, and also now I feel less guilty about ripping clips from the series to use in the main retrospective.
Well, thank you. I do get a little ass cap for some of the lyrics I contributed, or the Freaky Fred episode, which is entirely in verse. But I'll take the moment to point out that Jody Gray and Jody, who was the music director of the show, and with Andy Ezrin did the score. Jody and I really had been collaborating for a year before we met because of the way the show was set up. As I called it, a conveyor belt. I'm at the beginning and he's at the end. And but we've been best buddies and writing songs together ever since. Worked on a lot of projects and just a lot of songs that we just wanted to write. His contribution to the show was tremendous. There was such personality to the music, and the Freaky Fred episode really demonstrates that well. It's animation is such a wonderful intertwining of art and artistry and artists. So is any production, I suppose, but there's something about animation, I guess, being so musical that really appeals to me as a songwriter, which is in my heart. I growing up, I had two career choices. If I could say, what do you want to be? I wanted to be a Beatle or a talk show host. And I've come closer than most. So a song I wrote with Jody was on an album with a song that Paul McCartney wrote. So, so it was mentioned on McCartney's website. So there you go. Jody and I are Beatles. But well, actually, we're Duck Brothers. The Liverpudlian Duck Brothers, with the voice credited to Ringo Starr for a while on IMDb, but was actually my friend Will Ryan, who passed away sadly a few months back. he was also the voice of the Big Toe in the Clutching Foot, and and that's the thing. If you know the voice artist you're working with, you can write to their instrument, and knowing Will, and then deciding we were doing these Beatlesque ducks who sounded exactly alike, and I wrote this 30-second Beatles song that Jody then fleshed out, and halftime show. It's one of my because it's 30 seconds long. It's one of my favorite songs that we've written because it's a complete statement in 30 seconds.
Yeah, both of those episodes were great, and like you said, Will's performances were fantastic. I love him as the Clutching Foot, doing a fantastic Edward Gene Robinson impression, which as a kid, I had no idea why he sounded like that. But as an adult, I just love the randomness that the Foot immediately becomes a gangster. And I also think it's a testament to your guys' writing that we don't really question why a Foot sounds like a gangster or alien ducks sound like Ringo. We just accept it. Like, I can't imagine any different voice coming out of characters like them.
No, that's great, and that really speaks. I mean, the voice direction on the show, and the casting, um, really everything about it. And that's what I keep pointing out, is just the interplay of the different disciplines, and in the Clutching Foot, the Little Toe was played by Arnold Stang, who I grew up watching on as a live action actor, but also the voice of Top Cat. Really just like, he's always this nebbishy guy, skinny little guy, and he's always in Top Cat. He did a different kind of voice. He was imitating Phil Silvers in Bilko. He was to be more commanding, but as the Little Toe, Stang was just getting smacked all the time, like the Five Toe Stooges, bam, 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 bam. And I mean, it's an honor. It's such an honor to have, a friend like Will performing with a hero like Arnold Stang, and they're doing your work, performing your work. It's thrilling, and I've had that kind of experience over and over again. And that's a collaboration, that it's, even if the actor isn't present, if the actor's voice is strong enough. I was once writing a sitcom which starred Madeline Kahn and George C. Scott, and writing for Madeline Kahn was like writing for a great, cellist whose style you knew well, or violinist, or a Stradivarius. Her voice was just brilliant, and she was just there in my head, and I felt like I was collaborating with her whenever I'd write for her. And that was true, for a lot of the characters in animation that I've worked with. But very fond memories, and I miss Will Ryan, one of the most talented and eccentric and interesting people. And it's the world of animation is filled with some talented, eccentric, and interesting people, as you know.
Yeah, I imagine given your ages, you guys grew up in the heyday of all the Hanna-Barbera and Looney Tune cartoons constantly playing on TV. So I'm sure that made your sensibilities a little zanier, to put it mildly.
Oh yeah, yeah, and think about all of my friends who are also historians like Jerry Beck. Our tastes in animation is always for the wilder directors, and Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies. Frank Tashlin, who went on to do live action Jerry Lewis movies. But his stuff was whacked out, and Bob Clampett. These were singular artists, Chuck Jones, and then there were directors who were, they were fine, and they had their own signatures, but they weren't as overwhelmingly brilliant as, a cartoon like Book Review, with, I think, featuring Daffy Duck. Watch that if you want to have, some psychedelic fun and nightmares. That's the thing. A lot of those old Warner Brothers cartoons and Betty Boop cartoons, Fleischer Studios, there are a lot of scary episodes, and a lot of that influenced me, and influenced well, not just the way I wrote Courage, but a lot of other shows as well. But having terror in cartoons, having, some kind of danger, it's interesting. It's only as real as the lead character's reaction to it. And Bugs Bunny reacted to danger in a very nonchalant way, a very Groucho-esque. Nothing would ruffle him usually. If Bugs was screaming and worried, we were in trouble. And Courage, of course, is going to freak out, but he's going to let love pull him through this mess of fear and evil so that he can save sweet Muriel. That was his driving, it was love for him. It's just an interesting comparison of the way lead characters deal with the fears presented to them in the cartoon, and the evil, however evil Yosemite Sam might have been.
It's great, and obviously that was the whole moral of the show. Courage was always scared shitless, but he still did what needed to be done. And it's funny because the show is obviously always compared to Scooby Doo, and not just because of their premise of talking dog scary, but Cartoon Network really leaned into it by doing a lot of bumpers where Courage and Scooby and all of the gang were featured together a lot. Heck, they even did a pretty big promotional at one point featuring the Scooby gang going to nowhere, which would be later revisited in a crossover movie that we won't speak of.
I'm curious, when you're saying, is that based on your opinion of it, or uh, I'm not fishing for anything here. I'm just curious.
Okay, some of that was for comedic effect, despite me not actually liking it. That being said, I guess we'll take a little bit of a closer look at it. So yeah, the movie is competent. It looks and sounds good. It gets Scooby and the gang well enough, as I'm assuming this group has probably worked on a few Scooby movies before this. My problem really just comes down to the Courage stuff, as it feels very antiseptic.
Yeah.
Like, they knew what the characters looked and sounded like, they knew when to put references to certain things, and, they basically got the formulaic fashion of Courage, but Courage was never formulaic. And I don't think I'm being an old curmudgeon by saying it was better back in my day. But instead, I think it just highlights the fact that the only time John isn't involved, and writers like you, Irv, or William, or Michelle aren't involved, is the only time we get bad Courage.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, and then, gratifying isn't the word. I mean, do I wish I'd worked on it? Maybe. It's an interesting challenge. How do you fit those two worlds together? And I probably, would, eventually figure out a way that worked for me. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and really, I'll mention again. I mean, just to, so that we're not just ragging on this movie done by very talented people. What we had at Cartoon Network when we were doing Courage, and what everyone else at that time had, and Linda Semensky was someone who was running the network with Courage, and I didn't even think about that word when I said it just now. She had the courage that few executives have, which is let the people you've entrusted with a lot of money to make television shows, let them do their jobs, give them room. You're giving them room, or you're giving them rope with which to hang themselves. And truly, it was the show that had the least amount of network notes and changes. It was John. It was most of the notes that I was dealing with were John's. Occasionally the network would say something, but one of my favorite notes from the network, and this was from Standards and Practices, a little anecdote. I think it in Courage in the Big Stinking City. He's going to a room, and and the room number or the address of the place, I forget, was a room number or a street address, was 666 in the script, to invoke the devil, for all of those who are aware. And the note was, this is, this really speaks to devil worship and Satanism, and we think it better not to have it in the show, which that didn't come from Linda necessarily, against Standards and Practices, but I laughed at it, thinking about all of the twisted stuff that we've had in the show. This number was, so I said, okay, can we make it 666 and a half? And they said, yeah, that's fine. You just made a joke even better. I don't even know what the half means, but it's like 666 and a little more evil, half of a point more evil than just plain 666. Uh, and yeah, that stands out as like one of the biggest notes we got, and it allowed us to flourish. It's like getting together with friends after school and putting on your own show. And the shows were subversive. It's just, and now Linda is she works at PBS now, and very different kind of cartoon, but executives make, their job is often to say no, or they have to give notes. I worked for a well-known company that very well known for their animation, and it seems that it's like, if you don't give voluminous notes, you aren't doing your job, and it can suffocate. I mean, I welcome notes even if I disagree with them, because it's a chance to analyze what you've done and make it better because of the notes or in spite of the notes, and give all credit to the note giver. But when they're overwhelming and constantly changing, it's like, but we answered that, and then we have to move forward. And then at the end of the process, you're like trying to tie up, putting band-aids all over things, because you have to lock in at some point. You have to say, okay, this is the story we're doing, and we have to make this work. And we have to make this work in this amount of time. So I always believe in front loading that process. I'm outline this episode to within an inch of its life, know every move, and you be the owner of your universe, and then type fade in and write the script. Then you can have a lot of fresh air with which to bring the story to further life. So it doesn't always work as well as it did with Cartoon Network. I don't expect the network to not give notes. But a lot, it's a couple of executives who I've encountered throughout my career in animation, particularly, who gave good notes. It's like, wow, this is really helpful. Thank you. They go on to become writers, because they have good writer's instincts. Doug Wood, case in point, he hired my former partner me to do a rewrite on Balto for Steven Spielberg, the animated feature, based on something we'd written 5 years before that had this much animation, and it's the first thing we'd done for the big leagues. And we had such a positive experience with Doug sort of giving us notes. We never actually met with Spielberg. He was doing Schindler's List at the time, but he was giving us these notes and making them all work in a way that made our lives not easier, but made the work more sensible. And of course, Doug is a successful writer and director now, because he was that good. And as I always hesitate to say to a director who gives good notes, you should really think about writing, because I want to work with this executive in this position, this relationship again. But yeah, it's every project takes its own form in terms of its rigors, its exigencies, the demands it makes on you. And a lot of it comes down from various tops. There's the people who are actually paying for the project, the network, studio, whatever. And then there's the people who are running the show. And then in live action, writers rise to be showrunners. In writer-driven animation, and Writers Guild covered animation like The Simpsons, the writers become the showrunners. But in children's animation, the writers are kind of locked in at the beginning of the conveyor belt. Sometimes, if you have an executive producer title, you can be involved in things down the line. But often writers are consigned to the beginning of that process as freelancers. And the trouble is really getting them to get to know the show, and know the animation process, and sort of be involved in every step of the way. If I could change something in children's animation, I give the writers a bit more opportunity, to participate down the line in terms of the creative engineering of the show, and also participate in the profits down the line, because I don't mind saying that, Courage was not a Writers Guild covered project, and I got paid as head writer. But the only way to really make a living wage writing free animated shows like that is to be a head writer, or to have so many freelance scripts that your head is spinning. It's I still get, maybe it's pennies, but I still get residuals for episodes of Pee-wee's Playhouse that I wrote and episodes of Alf that I wrote. And with Courage, none of that. Just foreign collection agencies somehow get royalties from around the world, and they collect them for animation writers, and it's just sort of this magical, weird process that I really don't understand. But occasionally a check will show up from the Writers Guild West with a big, thick envelope filled with like how many times Courage has been airing in countries I've never even heard of, and the fractions of a penny that I make for each episode. And sometimes, the check is for $1, and sometimes it's for more. Writers Guild writers deserve better than they get in children's animation. That's and that's not a slam on anybody in particular. It's the system.
Of course, and to your point of a good producer or head writer protecting and shielding from too much interference with the network, it is amazing what you were able to get away with. It's funny, since my generation is derisively labeled as a bunch of snowflakes, and we have the stereotype that we were basically wrapped in bubble wrap and weren't allowed to see anything that could harm us. The whole idea that this comes from the era of the parental watchdog groups reigning supreme. When you watch shows like Courage, or even earlier ones like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, Cow and Chicken, all the Spielberg animated shows, and so on, we were exposed to a lot of adult humor, disturbing images, and a whole host of other content you'd assume we were going to be prevented from seeing if the stereotypes were true.
Yeah, and I think it's often true. Look, not everybody can deliver the shows that were delivered during that time, given all that freedom and money to make a show. But drowning a writer in notes is not helping the writer at all. As a head writer, if I'm reading a script and it's like, is it working for, does it sound like the show? Like, use Courage as a case in point. This is something I might not have ever thought of sort of as a Courage thing, but this writer just added a little bit of a different color to the palette here, to the, writer's palette as opposed to the artist's palette. As a head writer, I try to tune into what was the writer trying to get at, and rather than looking at it and saying, all right, this isn't working, let me get into my own version of this. It makes your life easier, because then they do better episodes. If you just rewrite somebody, as often happens in animation, I've had the experience where I'll write an episode of something, whether it's a primetime live action show or a cartoon, and I watch it, and my name's at the beginning, and I just don't remember a word of this. That maybe 3 or 4 words of this are mine. It was so thoroughly rewritten, and maybe I wrote an awful script and it deserved to be rewritten, but that's not the point. My point is that if in fact there was something I should have been doing that I wasn't doing, I never had the opportunity to learn it, because unless I'm pursuing the head writer of a particular project saying, all right, can you explain to me what the notes mean and why these changes were made, so that the next time I can, you don't usually find out what you're doing wrong, So I like working, for me, I like to make it as much of a collaboration as possible, as opposed to a, yes, I might have the final word in this room, but I'd like that word to be yours, So it's yeah, I don't want to get too preachy about my ideas about writing and how things should work, but it's a real place. Again, like I was talking about with voice actors and other artists, finding writers who bring a little bit more. Like yes, this is exactly our show, and it's a little more. It reflects the writer's individual vision, and let's see what we can get from that, rather than just keeping it so homogenous. Keeping it, it's like, this is the show. It fits into this space here. so yeah, it's not often that you get that much room to sort of well, to gestate, a show, because like the first season is sort of a real gestation process, and yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of other projects that I've been involved with, and there are just very few where sometimes you'll be working under somebody who has enough clout to protect you from crazy, stupid network notes. Not that they're necessarily crazy and stupid, but the head writer often has to synthesize a lot of sort of disparate notes that come from different people involved, and then interpret that for the writer in a coherent way. Sometimes as a freelance writer, I'll get a script back and it'll have notes in like 5 different colors, and the notes will contradict each other because they're all written by different people, and they will not have been synthesized by the head writer into something that I could, as a freelancer, understand. I mean, it's just, well, if it was too confusing for you to figure out, it's certainly too confusing for me. So let's have a discussion about that. So, trying to keep writers sane and focused. And sometimes it involves sort of being a very, very, tough filter between these notes and the freelancer. These notes, this freelancer, don't let those notes, no notes go, don't. Oh, freelancer, you're very nice.
Now, pivoting a bit, I think most diehard fans and even casual fans of the show just focus on the scarier episodes of the series. But a large amount of the episodes are very heartfelt and sweet, or ones that contain no conventional scary moments that end on either a happy or bittersweet note. I haven't done a full accounting, but I'd wager about a third of the episodes are in this camp. There are 2 specific ones that you wrote that I'd like to discuss. The first being The Curse of Shirley, which is one of the few times we sympathize with Eustace, in this case getting a glimpse of him unknowingly being kind to a child version of himself. It's a great segment and moment because we get a peek at why Eustace is such a miserable bastard and why he is the way he is, because no one ever showed him any kindness as a kid. That's a much deeper character exploration for an 11-minute talking dog cartoon than one would expect.
Well, thanks. I did I write The Curse of Shirley? I'm like,
You're listed on the title card for it within the actual episode.
I'm thinking either Susan Kem or Craig Shemin, 2 of the frequent contributors to the show. But perhaps I did. There are certainly, again, words of mine are in it, and by words of mine, I don't mean just words. Scripts are the words are the least important. The dialogue is the least important part of the script. Don't quote me on that. I didn't say it. But John has a real, sentimental spot, and so do I. And at the center of the show is love and sweetness and redemption. There's not always the need to redeem your villain, but it's sometimes very funny to do that, depending on how you handle it, but often very touching. And I remember that with Eustace, and that's very John. I think it was funny. I mean, just I'll bring up another episode, which was Little Muriel, which I know I did write, because more macaroni, more cheese, less macaroni. I hate macaroni and cheese. Just became quite a thing on the internet, and I remember writing it. It was very much alive. But anyway, it's Little Muriel, and you see, here's Little Muriel, and she's this little difficult, really annoying kid, and she's a lovely, loving older lady now. I didn't spend a lot of time analyzing, like, how did that kid get to be that nice lady? But it was interesting, and it sort of gave me pause. Okay, so she was a difficult little girl, or somehow in the magic of the episode, she was a different little girl than she actually had been, in terms of personality. But seeing Muriel drive Courage crazy, that to me was golden. Here's the little kid version of Muriel and Courage, now she's suddenly the villain driving Courage crazy, and he's got to be nice to her because it's Muriel. So that was it was always interesting to understand. It always helps to really understand where the characters come from, even if you're discovering it, a couple of seasons in and exploring. So let's do a young, Eustace episode, or young Muriel, little Muriel. Yeah, and little Muriel was just really antic. It wasn't like a deep character study. But yeah, there was a lot of heart in the show, and heart is really at the center of it. I mean, how could there not be that kind of thing? It all emanates from the title character, and it's certainly reflective of, John and his sensibility and mine, and then it was up to Jody to write, to score it so that it didn't feel, so that it didn't feel sappy, whether you're scoring it, like a big movie, or scoring it nice and small, or whatever. Man, he always just would give it the right touch, the right touch. And if you want to mention another episode, was that?
Yes, and the other episode I'd like to talk about is The Last of the Star Makers. Easily one of the most bittersweet episodes in the entire series, which gets into death and rebirth. Can you shed some light on this?
Like so many of the episodes, it was John's idea initially. Just quickly, I mean, often John would generate the episode in like, a short paragraph, and it would be approved. And then it was up to me to sort of guide this into becoming a full story. And Last of the Star Makers was, very much John's idea. And it was a pleasure to write it, because it was a nice break from the episode I'd written before, or had just rewritten, or given notes on, or gotten notes on. It's the thing about Courage, there were so many. We played with form in various ways, but certainly in storytelling. I'm a very sentimental person, and I cry easy. I get weepy, and if I'm writing a Courage script and I'm getting a little weepy, I don't want to run away from it. I just want to say, okay, I don't want to get too maudlin or anything, but Less of the Star Makers a lot of people remember that, really fondly, and really felt sort of a genuine, sense of what was at the center of the episode. And I'll also say, this is just, speaking to that and another point we were sort of talking about earlier, is that people who would watch, I was often concerned that we were scaring kids too much overall. If I was picturing a 5-year-old watching this, and friends of mine would call me up and say, yeah, I was just watching, the show I just saw for the first time with my 5-year-old. And I would say, well, watch a few more episodes before you keep watching it with your 5-year-old. But I think my fears were ill-founded, because most of the people I talked to today who grew up watching the show and were 5 when it premiered have said that the show helped them through difficult times in their childhoods, where they felt no control over a world that was not being kind to them. And of course, there's a wide spectrum of unkind, but children of abusive parents. I've heard beautiful podcasts just talking about how much sanctuary children found in this cartoon about this scared little kid, really, scared little dog, whose world was out of control. But with the right amount of love and smarts and action, he could control things. And, you can't control everything. And it's hard, as a parent, it's hard to tell your kid, everything's fine. I certainly don't know how to do that today. And my kids are adults. But it's really wonderful to hear from fans, and a lot of the comments on the Freaky Fred Reanimated thing really brought that out to me. How much children were able to feel strength as a result of watching Courage, and it didn't even occur to me at the time that this is what we were doing. We weren't trying, but it's sometimes when you're doing a show well, and you're doing it in a way that satisfies you and the people you're working with, if you're the right combination of people, then it's a dream, because you're speaking to something really honest, something central, that a lot of the kids watching can share, and take with them, So, when somebody comes up to me and says, God, you scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. You totally fucked me up. Thank you. Thank you. It's like, until I hear the thank you, I'm worried, But episodes like Star Makers, will children, now I'm writing that way, will kids follow this story? Yes, it challenged young viewers, I think, to sort of relish different types of storytelling, different levels of action. It's much easier to do an episode that's entirely a chase, uh, but it's got to have an emotional arc to it, and a character has to, famously Seinfeld was supposed to be it's a show about nothing, and nobody ever learns anything. I would argue against that. You have to connect with the show, and it's interesting. I mean, a lot of John's psyche is encouraged, and my psyche seeps in, and it's great having experience like that, where it wasn't just like one season. It really feels tangible to me, feels very present to me, because it was 4 full seasons of a show over, however couple of years that we did it, and I really miss Courage. That's the thing I think I felt worst about not working on the Scooby thing, is I want to spend some more time with Courage.
Well, that is a shame that you couldn't revisit Courage in that capacity. Now, doubling back to The Last of the Star Makers, this is the one I was really interested in rewatching. There were a handful of episodes, like I said, like Freaky Fred or Curse of King Ramses, Clutching Foot, and so on, that I remembered very, very well. And there's a few I didn't remember at all, but the majority fell into the category where I remembered the broad strokes of the episode, but didn't remember a lot of detail, and Star Makers fell into that category. I recall it being a very sad one. I knew the parents died, but not much else. So when rewatching the series, I was really excited to see this one and really get to re-experience it basically for the first time. When rewatching it, I was immediately reminded about how fantastic it was. I mean, that gut punch of both parents dying, especially the mother at the end, when conventionally she would have lived. I joke, but it's kind of like my generation's Bambi's mom. Everything about how you handle the sensitive subject about death of a parent or finding the beauty in the bittersweet moment really is just so well executed. This is truly one of the best 11 minutes of television animation you will ever see.
Wow. Well, on behalf of everyone involved, thank you. And yeah, I think you bring up a good point in the sadness factor, because it wasn't fear, it wasn't, there was sadness, it wasn't horror. It's as you say, can children accept this much sadness? And most of the time you'll get an executive saying, I was so depressed by the time I finished reading this. I don't want my kid, the kids aren't going to like this. How many times have I heard, kids won't like this, kids won't get this, kids, and my job isn't to argue most of the time. My job is to, just keep things moving and do the best show possible. But kids deserve a lot of credit. And when it comes down to it, I've never really written for a particular age group. Like I'll know if the show, I'm right, if it's for 2 to 4 year olds and it's got a math curriculum, well, I'm going to take in a Peg plus Cat, which is a little older than, it's like, I forget what the age range was, 4 to 7. But that was a show that was very sophisticated and very funny on a very adult level. One of my favorite cartoons as a kid was Rocky and Bullwinkle. And that was co-created by one of the co-creators or one of the seminal writers of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is why they're both set in Minnesota, Rocky and Bullwinkle and the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And as a kid, watching shows, watching cartoons that with references I didn't get, or something like Bambi, it's like, it's important to feel that. It's important for a child to be able to process that kind of thing and bring it forward into life. And it helps prepare you for certain inevitable sadnesses, or unexpected sadnesses, current, what's going on around you now. As long as the episode lands safely, and if you're going to have that degree of sadness in an episode, I want to feel like I'm sort of like holding, my child, if my child is watching this, at the end of it saying, watching it with them and sharing the emotion, and at the center of so many things that I write is empathy. I worked on a series recently where the driving, empathy is at the center of the show. Well, it always is for me. You can't, we certainly need more of it in this world, and are developing it while they're watching your show. So, and it's not all kind of like, you have to present things in a way that really crystallizes your point, and tell stories that don't hit the viewer over the head with, moralizing, or, here's a better way to deal with your life. They're just good stories, and they come from real places. And whether it's Courage the Cowardly Dog, or, sort of Alf, or this opera that I wrote that had nothing, wasn't anything funny within miles of it. These are, or the Seuss musicals that are worked on. These are all character-driven stories, and they all come from the same place. It's interesting because a lot of people do ask me, like, you've done a lot of different kinds of things, and some of my favorite writers have, crossed genres many times, and you kind of have to do that if you want to keep working. Certainly, if you're living on the East Coast, it's interesting. I mean, in the world of animation, to see what experience different writers bring to the table. Some of the more seasoned writers, as opposed to the newer ones. What worlds they've come from. And my first experiences writing in animation, I was working with people who weren't really animation writers. I brought them in. Alf Tales was the first cartoon that I was ever in charge of, with my former partner Roger, and that was I don't want to spin off into thinking too much about that, but the writers that we brought in, it was during the writer's strike in 1988, and the writers we brought in were writers we were striking with. These are Writers Guild members, and so it was during the writer's strike in 1988 that we were hiring our fellow striking writers to work on cartoons that they'd never written before. Some of them went on to work on shows like Futurama, and out of that also, I mean, The Simpsons grew out. A lot of writers during that time would turn to animation because it's not covered. A lot of it is not covered by the Writers Guild, but it's okay to write because it's not covered by you're not scabbing as a striking guild member. It's no accident that after the 1988 strike, you saw this upsurge in animation, both in prime time and in daytime children's animation. A lot of writers who hadn't been involved in it before that time, suddenly were turning to it. And I see a lot of friends of mine who come out of the world of late night comedy, now doing animation, and it's kind of a kick. You bring different sensibilities to it, but like I said, it's storytelling. Whatever it is, it feels the same to me. It's like, how can we best reveal our characters through story, and how best can story be generated by our characters, as you said in the beginning, as opposed to something simply happening to them. And then, how do we get out of this one?
Now, pivoting a bit, back in the day, Cartoon Network would do a series of bumpers called Cartoon Network Groovies, and They Might Be Giants did a kick-ass music video for Courage.
Oh, yeah.
Given that you mentioned you have a background in music and you were the head writer, were you involved in this in any way?
I just found it after the fact, and I couldn't have been more thrilled. I mean, I love They Might Be Giants, and we used to live in the same neighborhood, Park Slope in Brooklyn, roughly at the same time. I don't know, both Johns lived there, but it was perfect. I mean, and Courage has been referenced, and my kids would always send me, like, whenever he's referencing a rap song. Uh, I have a lot of street cred from Courage. It sort of penetrated popular culture in a way that, well, I certainly couldn't have expected, because I didn't know what the internet would look like 20 years after Courage, But well, tell me, just to repeat the question, because it spun me in several directions, which is, I mean, it's a good thing, but I want to focus on what you asked.
No, no, that's fine. Basically, I guess the larger point that I was asking is back in this era of Cartoon Network, the bumpers and promos were a lot more involved and creative than just a coming up next.
Yeah.
You had characters being portrayed as coworkers and carpooling together. Like I said, Scooby and his gang came to nowhere and visited the Courage cast.
Right.
So, as head writer, were you involved at all, or was this a completely different department and you didn't know what they were doing until you saw it on TV?
No, those were all a surprise, and probably also to Jody, who was doing the music for the show. It's a whole nother department, and I think They Might Be Giants. I was under the impression that they wrote the song and generated the video, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the network was involved in the video, but no, I mean, it's, and for me, there's a big difference between the network bumpers and, the promotional stuff for Courage that was sort of, where this is our corporate identity and this is a commercial for it, as opposed to, true celebrations like They Might Be Giants writing a song about this character that you're working on. And I always forget that, I actually, like, every time someone mentions that They Might Be Giants, oh yeah, it's like, I don't know if I saw it or Jody was telling me about it, but there was an interview with Billy Bob Thornton, and oh God, who was his girlfriend at the time? Was it Angelina Jolie? And it was, if I remember correctly, or if I was told this correctly, he said, "Oh, we'd love to." He put it very bluntly. There might be children watching this, and of course, I don't want to.
I highly doubt it. You're fine.
He said, "Yeah, sometimes we fuck and then just watch Courage the Cowardly Dog." And I thought, wow, that's a pretty interesting three-way right there. It's like they're having sex and then they like to chill. So about Netflix and chill, this is chill and Courage. And that's just, it's just at the risk of name dropping, I had Sigourney Weaver hug me because my son was in school with her daughter, and he knew that and they were like 11 at the time. And we knew that the daughter was a Courage fan. And then I met Sigourney Weaver at sort of a parents' meeting. So she was just another mom, but it's Ripley. It's Sigourney Weaver. And when I was introduced to her, and this was while Courage was in production, I said, "I'm Julian's dad." And she threw her arms around me and said, "Oh God, we love your show." And I was like, Sigourney Weaver, if I ever thought about meeting you, it didn't go like this. It would be me telling you how much I love your stuff. You don't know. You just don't know who's watching. And it doesn't, whether it's sort of the excitement of someone like Sigourney Weaver saying, "I love your show," or somebody saying, a fan coming out of nowhere or on a podcast saying, "This show got me through some really dark times and it kept me laughing." When you're doing a show, you're so wrapped up in getting it done. You really don't know who it's reaching, and it has the potential. There are people, I really want to work with on different things, and I sort of like, I'm almost tempted to leave it. I was the head writer of Courage the Cowardly Dog, because of all the things I've ever done. That seems to have like the greatest currency now, in terms of fan fervor and doing, if I do a panel at Comic-Con, we did a panel at New York Comic-Con, and it was first, the general idea was animation and music, the relationship. And Jody Gray was there with me and a bunch of other people. And then we did Freaky Fred live. And Jody played the score live on whatever instruments he could, while I did the narration. And Pilar Newton Katz, who was one of the artists on the show, actually drew the story as we were moving through it. It was an interesting exercise, but it's really wonderful. As a writer, you don't really get that kind of feedback, and then you're suddenly surprised when I'm suddenly surprised when Freaky Fred Reanimated shows up, and that was just a doorway into the minds of a lot of fans, all in one place. And then at some point, YouTube took down all the comments because they said, "Oh, this is for kids, and we can't have all these comments," because a lot of them were very adult comments. And then suddenly they reappeared. So I was really happy, because it was, it's just all of these, most of the fans who were posting were really revealing so much about the impact the show had on them. It's easy to say that's better than residuals. In a way, it is. I mean, I guess residuals will help you through life. It'll help you pay for bills, whereas feeling good about what you've done, makes you feel better about life, or the life you've chosen. And I think that's the thing. Going back to wanting to be a talk show host or a Beatle, part of that was, fame. And it's like, wow, I'd love to be in front of a camera and admired. But to me, the appeal was, these four guys creating music together, the intimacy of that, the magic of that, the collaboration. And for me, talk shows is like about good minds having good discussions. It wasn't about interviewing celebrities. It was about, it was interesting growing up. It was like, do you watch, I was very young, but are you a Johnny Carson fan or a Dick Cavett fan? And I like Carson, but I was a Dick Cavett fan, because I always felt that his interviews were more genuine discussions. So, the things I've done, Peter Jackson isn't going to do a movie about my rooftop concert, or re-edit a movie about my rooftop concert. But I'm just thrilled to know that there are so many stories that I will never know. So many lives that things that I've done have affected, so it really guides me further through, what I do now, and continuing to do this kind of thing. And also reflecting on the fact that when you do this kind of thing for a living, and your kids are 11 years old, my eldest son was 11 when I was doing Courage, and you're embarrassed by your parents at that age. So it didn't matter that I was working on a show that was very popular among his friends. He didn't want me to mention it at all. And then I did mention it when I had a car load full of his friends. I said, "Sorry, Julian, I just have to ask your friends a question. Do any of you watch Courage the Cowardly Dog?" And they all kind of exploded with glee. And it was kind of a breakthrough moment, I think, for Julian and me, my son, when he realized, wow, what my dad does is popular with my friends. And the number one fear is that your parents are going to embarrass you in front of your friends, which to my father's dying day, it was my fear. He would embarrass me. And he's on YouTube because he, at the age of 88, stumbled into oldjewstellingJokes.com and became a stand-up comedian. So my father, he's less embarrassing that way. But, and when I say that, it brings me back to Courage and just how much of my life actually found its way into the show, and how many of my own demons I exorcised, which I didn't even realize while I was doing it. I realize it more now, and I realize it more when I'm talking to fans who've had experience with the show. And I'm like, well, writing can be therapeutic. just finishing the fucking script and getting it in on time is even more therapeutic. But it's only now in reflection, when I think about certain episodes or moments where I say, okay, what would happen now? And I reach into my life and say, well, something that happened to one of my kids. This is more common for episodes of Arthur that I wrote, because there were stories about kids interacting with kids, and you can have a lot of real life experiences. But even with Courage, it's like, how would my son react to this? How would I react to this if I were that character? Because as you're writing, you're becoming each character. Again, you have to write from the inside out. And sometimes it startles me to see what I come up with, and 20 years later it startles me to realize, oh my God, I was telling a story about myself there and I didn't realize it. Or I was, through a story I was hired to tell, somehow finding a way to, as I said, exercise the demons, work something through. It's one of the great pleasures about having a career in the arts, where you're expressing yourself creatively, is you reach deeper and deeper into your soul. It can drive you to madness, or it can help you conquer madness, or both at the same time.
And I think that highlights why this show was so important to me. I was a very cowardly kid growing up, and I think it helped me be braver. Yes, Scooby Doo, which I loved equally, explored the same territory with its own cowardly dog, and Shaggy as well. But unlike Courage, Scooby and Shaggy's acts of bravery when it was shown came from the encouragement of their friends. Courage didn't have that luxury, he had to find it from within. I think that kind of storytelling and lessons makes Courage so special to me, and I'll admit, even all these years later, I get a little misty eyed watching some of them.
It's really sweet. And, lately I've done several interviews like this of different forms. And, it really fills my heart. It really does. And your affection for the show really means the world. And anybody who's listening to this or watching this now, thank you, for letting me into your brain at an early age. And not that you had any choice in the matter, because sometimes kids just are dropped in front of the TV by their parents. But it's very fulfilling, and it makes me want to do more things, and do more things in not in a way that's calculated to get this result, because I've never written, again, I've always written for myself or for the people I'm working with, and maybe adjusting the level. So I wouldn't use that word because no 5-year-old would understand it. But your reaction to the show was my experience writing it in many cases, from what we've been talking about today. And that really brings it full circle for me. So thank you very much.
Well, we are the ones that should be grateful for your work. Now, you said something that I'd like to touch on. You said that our experiences watching it mirrored yours writing it.
In my interview with John, he mentioned that Courage wasn't meant for kids in general, more for kids like him. Did you view writing the show in a similar way, or were you writing it for a broad audience?
My experience writing the show is very much the fans' experience watching the show emotionally. If I'm feeling it when I'm writing it, or I should say, what I've heard back from the fans now, when I do an interview like this and I hear what you've had to say, I just want to say thank you for paying attention. All of, the details in Courage, but also the very clear center of the show, which had a lot to do with heart and love and the things we do for that. And that we can, with love for another person, perhaps, we can overcome a lot of our fears and a lot of our, you got to put them aside, and it's interesting also, the lad raising children, gave me a real sense of that also, just like putting yourself aside. So, thank you so much for, sort of bringing me full circle in all of this. Uh, the comments you've made about the episodes, just, truly, I'll be thinking about this now for the rest of the day and reflecting on the episodes we've discussed, particularly, and sort of reliving the writing of them. If I can remember, some I remember writing, more than others, but it's just really interesting because of these, conversations like this, to go back and sort of reinterpret or understand better what you were doing when you were writing the show, because you were just trying to meet a deadline, and as well as you possibly, with as much, without sacrificing quality. So you don't have time to think about things like this. And, it really gives me a lot of encouragement to move forward, and without overthinking things, just keep sort of writing for my own heart, and my colleagues with whom I'm working, and for you, you now, and for you 20 years ago. I don't feel any different than I did, when I was your age or 5. I really don't. And I treasure being able to sort of reconnect with myself through experiences like this. So thank you so much for thank you, and all of the fans who are listening to this or watching this, for paying attention, and for not being shy about putting your voice out there and letting us know what you thought of the show. Not all of it is kind, but most of the conversations I've had about Courage have been, just wonderful and so fulfilling. And this is certainly, at the top of the list.
I sincerely thank you for the compliment, but again, it truly was my pleasure to have you on, and thank you so much for playing such a pivotal role and creating such a huge part of mine and countless other childhoods.
Well, thank you for watching, and and if you've got kids, let me know how they do. 20 years from now, if you're showing them episodes of the show.
Yeah, I'll show them. I just hope CPS doesn't come after me. Now, before I let you go, I do have a question. I just said a phrase that a lot of people will say about a huge show, game, or movie, or something that was really important to them when they were growing up. You created my childhood.
Wow.
I'm sure you've had to hear that a ton of times since the show premiered in 1999. So what's it like hearing that?
That's really something, that phrase, just, created my childhood, or helped, it's, wow. It's when you're doing it, you don't want to think about it, because it's it can feel like a burden, but you're writing for kids. That's a big responsibility, and I think, they deserve great storytelling. I think great storytelling helps the mind develop.
Well, the stories you guys told on Courage sure had to stimulate our minds, with stories ranging from slapstick to straight horror, episodes about lost love, parental death, depression, abuse, and more. You created a fantastic show that will always be special for a lot of people. So I think this is a good note to end on. We've been talking for a very long time, and while this is all great material, it's going to be a pain in the ass to edit this. So David, thank you for coming on and giving me a wealth of information.
Godspeed, Andrew Wass. Yes, edit this. Make me sound coherent.
No, you were great. Like I said, you've given me a wealth of information that I really don't know where to begin with. This is just awesome hearing so much information from this source. I might have to release this as separately as a bonus feature or something, because I know I'll have to make a lot of cuts, but I don't want to leave a lot of this locked up in the vault, never to be heard. Regardless, David, thank you for coming on. It's truly been my pleasure. And again, thanks for all the great memories you created with this show.
Anyway, it's all very inspiring. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Now, a note from the future. The exciting thing I have to say before the episode is over is this was just one part of a much larger look at Courage the Cowardly Dog. Check out the link in the description for a massive 3-part retrospective of the series, featuring interviews with fellow Courage alums, including series creator John R. Dilworth, staff writer William Hohauser, music composer Jody Gray, and the voice of Courage himself, Marty Grabstein, all live right now. Also live now is my full interviews with the rest of the guests, so I hope you check out because there's a ton more great material where this came from. Till next time, I'm Andrew Wasson. I hope you've enjoyed your time with us.